welcome. Today at Law and Liberation, we are sitting with Margo Okazawa-Rey, who is a professor emerita at San Francisco State University, best known for her work as the founding member of the Combahee River Collective and for her long-standing anti-militarism feminism work. Thank you, Margo, for joining us today. I want to start first a little bit with your own movement roots and foundations to your work. How would you describe your movement's work and your goals?
First of all, thank you for having invited me to be part of this, what I think is, very important archive and educational resource for folks in various movement spaces. So thank you. I'm honored to be part of it. Um, I would, describe my start as a feminist and as an activist by talking about my family's origin. And I know maybe later we'll be talking about identities, but I want to start with that because actually my mom was the first transnational feminist I knew. And the older I get, the more I recognize the importance of her influence and her life experience and how that shaped me. And also my dad, African American U.S. military, part of the occupying forces in Japan post World War II. My mom was um, a Japanese woman. There were different class backgrounds, and just what I described, you can see the structural inequalities between them. Nonetheless, they got together, they um, raised me, and we lived in different parts of the US. Uh, well, it was my first 10 years being in Japan. And I think that just the fact of my existence gives me the inspiration and a kind of a politics of possibility that says whatever the social categories are in place, they are social categories. They're made up by people. And so, as activists, it's important for us to challenge the status quo, including, on the left status quo, the ways that there's a certain kind of dogmatism, etc. So I want to start there as a starting place to say the fact of my existence is to me evidence the politics of possibilities. And then later in my 20s, I joined various movements, specifically the women's liberation movement of the 70s in the Boston area, and of course, the Combahee River Collective. Um, it's also really important that I want the listeners to know that the most important lessons, the most important, most fundamental roots and intellectual foundations of my work and of my being are things I've learned, lessons I've learned, theories I've helped produce or have been part of really thinking through with the activists on the ground. It's not through any academic books or those gave me words, perhaps concepts, but the substance of my intellectual foundation is what I've learned um, from and with the activists and the ways that we work together to create different kinds of knowledges and understandings. And that's really important for me to underscore because activists and activist knowledge making are, regularly dismissed as not good enough, or they're too subjective, or you've heard it all, right? And so really, I know 50, 54 years later, I guess, that the most profound lessons have been learned through experience working collectively with other activists in organizations, simply formations. And so I want to start by giving credit to a vast number of people. And I talk about it as, you know, people who have loved me into becoming who I am as an activist and as a human being.
Great. You mentioned, I'm really glad you mentioned this idea of activist knowledge making. And I wasn't sure if you wanted to add more definition to that because I think it's not a phrase that oftentimes you hear. And so just before we move into through this interview, I wanted to maybe, put a pin on that if you wanted to elaborate.
Yeah, I mentioned just a little while ago about activist knowledge making. And what I mean by that is that throughout history of women's movements, feminist movements, progressive movements, there have always been people on activists on the ground, ordinary people on the ground trying to explain things, right? And that is what a theory is. It's an explanation of a phenomenon, something that's facing people's lives. And activists do it all the time. Ordinary people do it all the time, but they're never really given credit for it. So I'll give you an example. And one of a movement that's been the most shaped me the most, um, and that is the International Women's Network Against Militarism, and the U.S. part of it, which is the Women for Genuine Security. And we've been together since 1997. We are a network. We're not funded by anybody directly. We raise funds as we need it, but it's a network of feminists, some academics, activists, young people on the ground dealing with the daily struggles in the locations of Okinawa, Philippines, South Korea, Guahan, different parts of Asia Pacific. And through our work together, through our conversations, we've come up with something that we think is really important, which is our feminist framework for genuine security and a culture of life. Right? And this goes against, it's a challenge to the dominant notion of security, which is militarized, which is nation state centered. And we're saying through all those decades of being together and understanding different experiences that this is our vision,
Hmm.
right? And it's based on connection. It's with one another. It's based on uh, being stewards and of the natural environment. Honoring cultural identities. All those things that we think create genuine security, not military, not capitalism, right? And so that's just an example of how, through the decades, by learning about each location, and going to the different locations together, studying together the actual lived conditions, we've been able to come up with a vision, right, that talks about, that captures, and that is actually a theory also, right? Because it helps, embedded in it is an explanation of what causes insecurity. So, and I would give the credit, to the people in the network who we work together to, come up with this vision. So that's an example, and I think the Combahee River Collective Statement is another example, right, where that's had a long life. And what's important about both of those examples, the International Women's Network Against Militarism, um, a feminist vision of genuine security in a culture of life. That's the title. And the Combahee River Collective Statement is that, you know, they are promoted by people who believe in those ideas, right? And in the case of the Combahee River Collective Statement, it's generations, at least two, three generations of feminist academics who, have assigned it in their courses. Then the activists, use it, etc. So both of those statements are really good statements. Both of those are very relevant, but they could have just died on in somebody's library or somebody's bookshelf, but they were activated by people on the ground who thought what was said in those statements is really important, right? So the it's not like either of those had a kind of institutional backing that books that are published by UC Berkeley or Oxford University Press or any of the presses, um, uh, have that kind of stamp of approval, right? The stamp of approval comes from the users of those documents, not institutions.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Am I
Yeah,
being like a little
it
bit?
makes perfect sense, and also I think you capture this dynamic synergy between like meaning making theory and practice. And I think the two examples that you gave are, you know, perhaps to some listeners, the Combahee River Collective is probably more known, has gotten maybe wider traction than
Mhm.
the militarism statement, but they I do see very common threads between the both, and maybe we can dig deep between on both. How do you think either the River Collective statement or the feminist vision, the International Network Against Militarism's vision, the relevance today? Like, how does these statements and principles and activism kind of resonate for perhaps newer activists? What could they draw from these statements and from these, you know, I guess really praxis documents? I wouldn't even call them just statements because they have this dynamism to them, right?
Mhm. I think the relevance of both of these documents has to be made explicit, right? Both of these documents, to be relevant, have to be activated by people who see their value, people who see their relevance, right? And then activate them according to some principle that they're drawn to. Because remember that there's no perfect, flawless, you know, um, statement, document, book, film, anything, right? And so whoever sees these need to look at them and say, oh, I see how this is relevant. So for example, in the Combahee River Collective Statement, it's one of really, I guess, the first in um, contemporary feminism. And back then, contemporary, it's kind of 50 years old now, but, that really articulated this idea of intersectionality, right? But you take a concept like that, and 50 years on, it's been interpreted in so many different ways. And, um, you know, the, the essence of that notion, which is power, has been almost completely diluted. Structural power, right? When we talked about intersectionality and the, the different categories, we weren't just saying we embody multiple categories, full stop. We were saying how those categories are have some relationship to the structural arrangements in the society,
Mm-hmm.
therefore are about power,
Hmm.
right, and marginalization. But typically now, just that word just gets used any old way,
Yeah.
and so with typically also the power piece, the structural power piece getting kind of thrown to the side or forgotten about. So that's really important. So you can have a statement like the Combahee River Collective Statement, which is still very relevant in many, many ways, but it's been interpreted, reinterpreted, and so this goes to my point that every group, every generation that reads these statements, right, has to interpret them and apply them and go beyond them as they're doing their work, go beyond them through their own praxis, right, through their own understandings in the context of different changing um, social, political, economic relations.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm struck by your comment that how the structural power analysis has kind of gotten sidelined in at least the Columbia River Collective, and we see that throughout movement work. Are there
Right.
some
It
lessons?
has.
Yeah, are there some
Yeah.
lessons or
Yeah, I
insights?
think there's another thing. There's another thing about, in a way, it's kind of an appropriation, right? So that in one of the lines in the statement, the statement that says something like, if Black women are free, all would be free,
Yes.
right? And that had nothing to do with we're the most oppressed. So if we're liberated, then everybody else will be liberated too. This goes back to the structural piece,
Mm,
right? That structurally we're marginalized and we're oppressed, right? And if we change the structures, right, then everybody who's affected negatively by the institutions and the structures would have a chance for liberation. And what's happened is that there's been a little hierarchy of oppression that was created,
mm,
right? And this one is most Black women are most oppressed, then this one, this one, this one. And Audre Lorde talked about there is no oppression hierarchy, oppression Olympics, right?
mhm,
But that line has been taken and that line has been used, I think, mm, to justify a kind of hierarchy of oppression, and I regret that,
mm,
But once you write something, and it's out of your hands, right, you can't control how somebody will interpret it, how it will be taught in the case of women's studies courses or feminist studies courses, sociology. So the And so all of this to say that it's very important that people, feminists, activists, write their statements, their manifestos, their analyses of whatever they're working on, knowing that once it's out of their hands, it might be reinterpreted in any old way. And therefore, our responsibility is not just to write it, but to really work with it ourselves.
mhm.
to activate what we've written and not just leave it as a document.
With that in mind, do you have any suggestions? Because Law and Liberation is a public education series. You may have newer activists listening on. And what are some tools or skills or methods that they can use so that this appropriation doesn't happen? You mentioned already to constantly be active with it. But are there, as they're reading, maybe the statements, including and I want to get to the network against the militarism, as they're reading and studying these, are there some suggestions that you have so that they fully appreciate and understand the like politics that's imbibed in these statements?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to make it, I want to make this concrete for someone can take what you're saying and then read the statements and say, okay, this is what we need to be doing, or we need to put these practices in place to ensure that, power is centered, that, and we haven't gotten to your analysis around militarism, globalization, and capitalism, but any insight?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, I think something I've come to learn, and also something I remember about the past in our earlier activist days, as far as lessons for how to sort of keep intact some of the things that were put out. I think the first thing is we used to study. We used to have study sessions where we really tried to learn what we could from a text, right? Whether it's an article or a book or whatever. But these study groups really helped us, you know, understand what we thought was being meant. Um, and so, for example, well, what are they talking about when they say intersectionality? Let's look deeper into the text and see if we can fathom it out. And then let's step back and look at the people in our situation, our constituents, the people whose lives we're connected to, and see if some of the things they're saying we can see in other people's lives, like that. So it's going back and forth,
Mm,
right? I think sometimes folks are too quick to read it very quickly, maybe not even read the whole thing, just take the words that really
mm,
they're drawn to,
mm,
and then, interpret the document based on those.
mm.
And I'm saying deep reading and as a way to understand, I think is a really first important step. And then always comparing that to the lived experiences and historical experiences of people whose lives, we're committed to, um, improving.
I think that's really helpful, and most movements have had some form of political education circle where, and it's done collectively. That's not like reading on your own, but appreciate what you said. It's that you're reading together, but then you're also looking at how does it affect the communities that we're each part of. So it's like two steps.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And I think that there's a third step in what I'm talking about, which is that we need to be asking different kinds of questions, right? Typically in the study groups or when we're doing movement work, the questions always have to do with, or typically they have to do with, what are we doing? How are we doing it? What are the impacts? They're all kind of technical, rational questions, right? And those are important. And I think it's equally important, perhaps in this moment, even more important, right, to ask other kinds of questions, right? So, for example, let's take this question of power, right? So, we're reading the Comprehensive Collective Statement or whatever statement, and in this moment, they're talking. The statement talks about oppression, right? And it looks like it's the definition is pretty clear in there. But in this moment, how must we understand power,
Mm-hmm.
right? What have we seen about how people in power constitute and reconstitute themselves and the institutions in such a way that it would benefit them, like, for example? Or, you know, how do we understand what are the contradictions we live with as activists? How do we understand those contradictions? And when does living with contradictions end up end us up being hypocrites? Right? It's one thing to live with contradictions. It's altogether structural contradictions, and altogether another thing for us to say one thing and then be talking something else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or what does some particular phenomenon really mean to our communities and to us as individuals, people who we care about, right? So really in pushing to think about um, meanings, pushing also to think about what have we learned from the past, right? And on that point, for example, what is something we absolutely believed in as a movement, and we know now that it's like it's not true or it can't be true in this moment, right? That's what I mean, asking different kinds of questions.
Well, it's understanding are you saying to understanding like the current moment and asking those questions that speak to that moment? I mean, you know, I, yeah, I want to just sort of pause on what you said because I think understanding the contradictions versus structural contradictions versus being kind of hypocritical or like misaligned with one's principles. I want to come back to that in a
Mm-hmm.
bit because I think that's a common tension that many movements face,
Mm-hmm.
co-optation and appropriation. So I want to come back to that in a bit, but I want to bring in your work around militarism, and because I think we don't hear a lot about that in movement. I mean, maybe a lot of movement spaces. Can you share how you draw connections between militarism, globalization, and you have a concept called militarized globalism? If you can share a little bit about those insights that come from your work.
Yeah, I think, you know, thinking about the concept of militarism, militarization, and um, the ways in which militarism is related to neoliberalism and economic globalization is something that has come to me over time, right? And militarism is more fundamental than armed conflict, right? Militarism is much more in the roots than specific wars, specific genocides, specific ways in which, like we're seeing in the US, the National Guard and the US, the military itself, being pulled into cities, right? It's important to think about militarism. Like the image we use in our network is think about mushrooms, think about mycelium,
Mm-hmm.
right? Mycelium grow under the ground, right? And then they pop up somewhere,
Mm.
right? Militarism is a whole set of practices, structural arrangements, values, ways to deal with conflicts that are deeply embedded in the society, right? So just take language, for example,
Mm.
right? Movement language, strategies, tactics. That's military talk. Look at sports, defense, offense, right? Look at the ways in which uh, there was even a time where there was, a very big fad on um, uh, what do you call that military? What do you call that? um, not uniforms, but khaki kind of military style clothing,
Yeah,
you know,
camouflage. Hmm.
camouflage chic.
Yeah.
I'll never forget seeing in Zurich, a Zurich boutique, a camouflage outfit,
Mm.
right? And being so shocked. This was Zurich high end, and there was this outfit. Um, and you can see it all over the place. Um, and it's also, militarism is also, an important part of militarism is also dehumanization, right? It's militarism also is racialized, gendered, classed. There's the category of nation that's also all part of it, nation and nationalism, right? And armed conflict, um, and using weapons of various kinds, from language to drones to bombers, right? Those are just manifestations, right, of militarism. And you can see in US society and globally how quickly everything is escalated militarily, right? And that these weapons building nations and corporations were like on standby, just waiting
Hmm.
for wars to happen so they can make enormous profits. Um, the biggest weapons producers and exporters are in the United States, right? And then behind them, China, Israel, Japan, also, corporations. So it's this relationship between profit making and profiteering around the wars, right, and armed conflicts and preparations for wars. Think of the countries that are buying weapons just to be ready, in quotes, or be its military preparedness, right? So that's one part of it, and that these 2 years of the genocide in Gaza has been, they're laughing all the way to the bank.
Mm.
These military corporations, they've seen the biggest profits, since decades, right? And so, the listeners can go look up the statistics. What I want to do is make this point of the relationship between militarism, militarization, armed conflict, and capitalism.
Mm.
And wars are always about resources, whether the resources are human resources, natural resources, including land, water, oil, minerals, anything that's considered precious, that is usable for capitalist production and profit making. Wars are always about that, and about access, right? So the area, you know, um, between Egypt and Palestine, Yemen, all it's a big waterway,
Mm.
right? There needs to be access to transport goods, right? So that's another resource, access through, natural, in this case, waterways, right, to transport things. The other thing that I've learned over the years, and it's really, really clear to me now is that national leaders, right, pull out the religion card or the nationalist card or identity card, whatever, right, to, to rally people behind a particular cause that the elites are interested in. But it's never about the people, right? And the people's interest, the best interests of their people. The other thing is that we talk about these blunt instruments of global north, global south, you know, these big categories, and I've come to see that the elite of every group, right, have the biggest solidarity movement,
Mm,
way stronger than any social movement, right? Because these folks really stick together to achieve their goals. So you can talk about the elites in the Middle Eastern countries, you can talk about the elites in European countries, the US, et cetera, right? Every place, the elites have locked their arms together because they know what they're going for, right? Very clear. And we don't have that kind of solidarity.
mm,
And we say, oh, this country is better than that country, etc. But if you peel back these layers, you need to look at who are the elites, how are they benefiting, and what's their role in keeping the mess going.
mm. Yeah, I want to. We will talk about solidarity, like in the face of that, and how we can strengthen that. I want to deepen your insight. I mean, talk a little bit more about the militarism because you've given us a framework and a definition. You also mentioned that some language that we use in social movements use military language. What are some ways in which we can change that? Now with that mindset, I'm just thinking about my own work, with the militarism framework. What are some ways in which social movements can begin to maybe think about militarism in the context of their own work?
I
Given your
think that's the first step, is they have to think about how militarism manifests in their own work, right? How does it get played out within our own movements?
right.
Language, the social relations, it's because militarism always is about hierarchies also.
Mm,
It's about ways that decisions are made or orders are made and orders are accepted without thinking too much. Um, it's also really important, if we're going to understand militarism, to look at it globally, the military apparatuses related to capitalism and war making and all of that, and the relationship between foreign policy and domestic policy, and particularly in the US. Um, but I think in many places there's a separation between domestic policy and foreign policy,
mm,
right? So we don't make the connections, right, between the tactics and I'm using these words very purposefully here, right? The strategies and tactics used to colonize another place or support a particular war, and even just in very concrete terms, a military budget that's over $1 trillion, not including any special assistance to any other country that's outside the official budget, right? And the the cutting back of everything that's about life saving and life supporting in the US. And we're seeing this right now,
mm,
all the cutbacks in special education, things that really matter to us, right? matter to us in the sense that they're life supportive, they're life giving, and you can almost make a direct connection, you know, from the bucket here, the money flowing into these other buckets that are about military operations and all kinds of stuff,
Mm.
right? And I think we in the US have not been really good at making those connections. You know, of course, there's some organizations like the National Priority Project who does that, um, and other entities, but that's not the usual way that the conversation between domestic and foreign policy is even had.
At the moment, there's discussions around or awareness around authoritarianism with the Trump administration. There's at least the mention of fascism, you know, depending on who you are, we're either
Hmm.
heading towards it or we're already in it. Can you help listeners understand how does militarism fit in within these other terminologies that are at least gaining some awareness? And if you can, shed light on your own definition of these terms. Are they interrelated, or is militarism distinct? How does it relate to
I
what at
think
least
it's
everyone? Yeah.
important to,
Mm,
yeah, I think it's important to think about militarism and militarization.
mm,
Militarism is a set of beliefs, ideology, etc.,
mm,
right? Values that undergirds militarization. And militarization is the process by which cities, nations um, become basically weapons of mass destruction,
mm,
right? Um, and so, and those are the military is deployed whenever something of value is at stake. And it could be ideological, right? Or it could be very material, right? But it's militarization is the process by which certain um, institutions are put in place, right? So militarism is the values, ideology, etc. Militarization is the process through which those values, ideologies, practices are put into operation,
mm.
right? And when militarization sets in, it's very easy to deploy the troops into cities,
I see.
right? To deploy the U.S. Marines, you know, wherever you want them to go, right? And it's important also, there was a term going around, you know, the militarization of the police. That was a mistake to frame it that way, right? Because the police have always been part of the military apparatus,
Mm,
right? So they may have received new kinds of equipment, for example, but the ideology, the values are all part of it.
I see.
You know, they're an arm of the military. They're the local arm of the military.
And so, how and is militarism or the process then brings us to governments that are authoritarian or fascist, or how is the relationship between militarism, the beliefs, the militarization, the process, and what an authoritarianism and fascism? Because I think now there's a growing awareness around authoritarianism, not just in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, but globally, and
Mm-hmm.
fascism. But I think what you are adding to our understanding is this belief system of militarism. And I'd want us to be able to draw connections or relationship between these concepts. If
Right,
if
right. To draw the relationship between those concepts, fascism, authoritarianism, and
militarism.
militarism, I think you have to really look at, the definition of violence,
Hmm.
right? That these, and think about the continuum of violence. Right? So the U.S. society has always been a violent society, right? Historically, founding, all the way until now. At times you see it more, clearly than at other times, right? So my understanding, right, is that the more extreme the belief in authoritarian, the practice and belief in authoritarianism, right, the more the society is, the state, I mean, is likely to use military violence, military arm, mil- violence, and direct violence
Hmm.
through weapons and batons and tear gas and all those things that we think about as military equipment,
Hmm.
right? But they go hand in hand,
Hmm.
right? And more extreme a society becomes, the more extreme its leaders are willing to use the kind of military violence,
Hmm.
right? And it's it's cross-cutting, right? Um, and I think the other thing is early when the people are more controlled by hegemony, that is more of a willingness to say, oh, the dominant group interests, we align with those, we believe in those values, etc. Right? When there's that kind of hegemonic power, the most powerful thing, there's no real need for extreme violence. But when people start pushing back, then you'll see a kind of correlation, right? Stronger the pushback, the more violent
Hmm.
typically that society has become. And you can see it throughout the history of the US. And I'm sure if we looked across um, other locations, we would see a similar pattern. Right? As long as we can keep the people docile,
Hmm.
right, the state is willing to, that's what hegemony is, right? You give them little crumbs and it makes people believe that, oh, yeah, we're on the same side, or I want to be like that.
Hmm.
I want to be in that power position. And as long as that's in place in a good, solid way, there's no need for direct violence that we're seeing now.
So is the increased violence by the state, the deployment of the National Guard, ICE enforcement, is that a sign that people are pushing back? I mean, what can we, so maybe we can move to taking the militarism framework to the present US context of how, what, we're sitting, in your kind of collective political circle and analyzing the moment. Um, what do you see as kind of this use of the state violence? Is that because people are pushing back? I mean, I'm just trying to understand, is that kind of, I mean, I have heard people say that, the more the state pushes back, that means there's stronger movement. But on the other hand, you said earlier, we also need to strengthen our movements as well. So I'm trying to,
Yeah, there's not, so you have to look at the whole kind of history from a longer view, not just this last few years, right? So that since a particular time, right? First of all, there's always been resistance. Nobody said, okay, we're going to just take it as given, right? No oppressed people have said that or done that. But if you look at all the rollbacks, everything from Roe v. Wade, DEI, the cutting back of civil rights, all those were seen as people refusing to accept the status quo,
Mm.
right? And so the um, the the labor unions, the various rights groups, reproductive justice, they were all pushing in their own ways, not accepting the marginalization of LGBT people or women or workers, right? And, you know, there was a kind of the way that hegemony has worked in this country, in the US, is that there were always these little crumbs given, right? Civil rights movement, voters, voting rights, even having people in the academy who look like you and me, right, have been signs that the system works,
Mm.
right? And so let's just, go along to get along. Let's encourage people to become like us, become an academic, become a professional, right? And, you know, join the middle class somehow, right? With um, these these forces really pushing more and more, right? It hasn't been a direct kind of resistance as we have seen necessarily, right, in the direct anti-war movement or, you know, um, the Black Power movement, right? But it's been a more kind of a gradual change. But you remember that people in positions of power, right, will use anything and make that a threat,
Mm. Yeah.
right? And also, it's part of this regime is the struggle is a global economic struggle. It's not just within the U.S. It's getting played out in certain ways in the U.S. But there's a whole global. I don't want to call it a Cold War, right? But there's a whole
But is mhm.
neoliberal. There's a neoliberal struggle among certain nations, right? A challenge to who's going to control the resources, etc. Right. So that's the bigger struggle that's pulling states and people in a particular direction.
Yeah. Can you say more about
Both.
that? Because I think it's important for folks, most folks who are listening probably are engaged in maybe US based struggle, but yourself and I are also connected to struggles outside the US, and we understand that. But um, can you just say a little bit more, elaborate on that? Because
So
yeah, on
yeah.
this.
So just one thing I've noticed, and folks can look for those data themselves. But the military budget has been increased in many countries around the world,
Mhm.
right? And they include countries in Asia, Pacific, Europe, US, certainly, Latin America, right? Maybe a little bit less. But everywhere that I mentioned, they've increased their budgets and cut back on domestic spending. Germany is an example of that. Japan, Korea, all these countries are increasing their military budgets. And because there's a global struggle, economic struggle, who's going to control the global economy, who's going to gain access to the resources that are needed, right? All these conflicts whether you're talking Gaza or Myanmar, um, Congo, etc. They're about resources
Mm-hmm.
and access. And under the banner of ethnic cleansing or whatever, right? And we can just look up the statistics and see which countries have raised it. There's a very good resource called CIPRI. You probably know it already. Stockholm.
Yeah, we can provide that for readers afterwards.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those statistics, right? You can get those statistics. But I think those statistics are important. I can't tell you cite those statistics because they're changing all the time, but that there is a global trend on the risk of the use of nuclear power, and increase in military spending.
Yeah.
And, the role of AI. And I don't know enough about the AI role to talk uh, uh, in an informed way about it, but that's something for your listeners to really look into, the relationship between AI and militarism.
Yeah, there are battles around more data centers and land, so
Mm-hmm.
there's some interesting struggles there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just to now maybe winding down for today's conversation, there are a couple of threads that I wanted to. Well, was there something on the militarism topic that you wanted to share before we move to solidarity and maybe some personal reflections, because you've been in this movement work and sustained it for a long time. And I think um, sometimes I hear many younger activists feel sort of a sense of despair and hopelessness. So I want to end maybe with some wisdom, thoughts, reflection from that. But was there something on militarism before we?
No, yeah, I think that's enough for now.
Yeah. So in this context, and I'm glad that you mentioned that this is really this global struggle and increased militarism. What are ways in which we can embody solidarity in our movements or bring some of these ideas into our respective movements?
I think what gives me hope and
Mm-hmm.
is each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I know in so many parts of the world, feminists and other progressive folks are leading, you know, um, their communities. They are working together across borders, and to, build, to imagine the world they want to create and to build it, right? There, we are under enormous odds. There's no question about it. There's, this is not going to change in the next 5, 10, 15 years. We're talking, you know, generational changes, right? And it's not linear. It's not a linear one step forward. You just keep moving in a particular direction. What gives me hope is that there are formations, there are people working together and doing both the reactive work, like so taking care of basic needs, but also the generative work of setting up infrastructure and taking care of one another and learning about each other, and you know and using love, and respect, and all those really important values, relational values, right? To to build and strengthen movements. I think many of us have learned that strategies, tactics, goals, objectives, all those things are important, but it's not the foundation, right? The foundation of solidarity work is really building relationships in such a way that those relationships can withstand and overcome and transform the forces that we know are going to come at us whenever we try to get together,
Mm.
right? The divisions of race and gender and class and nation are very real, right? And we know they're going to come at us. They're in the movements, right? And so how do we recognize how they manifest in our specific movements and in specific ways at a particular moment in time, right? And how are we going to make sure that we hold hands and stick together so that we can move through those, right? We know they're going to, it's there, right? That's the old playbook, divide and conquer, oldest as the history that we know, right? And so for us to be in true solidarity means that we recognize history, we recognize lessons we've learned, we admit to mistakes, we recognize the structural power inequalities among us, right? And that we relate with a lot of humility. And for me, humility means a couple of things. One is that we realize that our destinies are interconnected, right? That's one. Humility means that we are part of a bigger collective of folks, past, present, and in the future. That there's no one single person who can do anything and has done anything, even though they may be held up as the leader, right? That's a myth. And so humility means recognizing the collective ways in which we have operated, whether you recognize it or not, um, that nothing ever gets done by an individual. So that's the second point. Recognizing the people who have come before us, people who will come after us, people who are here now who have made certain things possible, and that we're just one, or our group is just one group of many groups. And the third thing is for us to really have a longer lasting solidarity movement. I think we have to have basic principles that we're committed to. And it can't just be anti-oppression, right? Basic principles, generative principles that tell us why we're together, on what basis we're together, right? Not just because we're against this or we're trying to do some, action together. Like all those are important, but I think it's important for us to start with our values and our vision. And the values and vision, we have to create spaces where we can have those conversations and then connect them somehow, right? And the connections need to be local, regional, and across regions. And it can't be based on identities. Identities, as June Jordan says, connections around a shared oppression or some identity that we didn't even necessarily create are about as predictable as the weather. Right. So we need to have something that we say these are our values, right? Strong relationships, love, embracing conflict as opportunities. These things. I mean, humility,
Yeah, before I ask the last question that I ask all interviewees, um, these relational values and skills are really hard to, bring into movements, from my experience. And I do think that there are some amazing folks, including yourselves and others, that are insisting that we bring into movements. And I definitely think it's from a feminist perspective. I think feminist organizing always thinks about the relational. But to concretize it a bit, do you have any resources or thoughts on how one can cultivate those skills? I mean, because I could see someone saying, I'm not so good in that relational stuff. I'm not a people person, or therefore I'm going to focus on I'm going to focus on the brass tacks, because I know how to do, policy and kind of like mobilization. But if you did, it's something that I think about a lot is how do we bring those skill
Hmm.
set into movement spaces? If you had some thoughts before
Yeah, I don't think about them as skill sets. I think about them as ways of being,
Mm,
right? So that a person can say, well, I'm only really good at this, and I think so. I just want to do the tech stuff, or I only want to write the proposals. And I think going back to my point about a different kind of question,
mm,
right? How is it possible that we can have a genuine movement, a genuine solidarity movement, if we're not committed to each other as people, and if we're not willing to recognize, our own and our own, even our own inclinations, and be willing to grow,
mm,
right? How can we actually really stick together if our only sticking together is something technical?
mhm.
What if you no longer have the tech skills? Does that mean we just get rid of you, or you're no longer valuable? And this kind of transactional relationship is the dominant paradigm, especially these days, and individualism, right? So that person, yeah, so I can do this part and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it well. But then, uh, how does that part relate to these other parts, right? This kind of rugged individualism is going to be the downfall, I think, particularly of US movements. And I've seen it more here than I have in other places, I must say.
Yeah, I agree. Last question I ask all interviewees. This is law plus liberation. And so, in the spirit of what you said about we have to have our own values or vision, what does liberation look like to you? What does it mean to you? Um, what does it taste like, smell like? Like, what is it that we're striving towards? What would be your definition of liberation? And as you're thinking, the word liberation was intentionally chosen by this series because it is a terminology that I've mostly seen in movement spaces, right? That's something, and mostly from individuals from marginalized communities. And so, what is our vision?
Yeah,
Just to stitch it together.
yeah. I think when I hear these concepts, I like to turn them into verbs, right? So, what are we trying to liberate ourselves from, right? Um, how will we know when we're liberated? And um, how will being liberated, and now I'm thinking collectively as well as individually, right? Because liberation is a collective effort,
Yes.
right? individual freedom, maybe, choices, all that stuff, maybe individual, but I don't believe that either. But liberation is when we can collectively, you know, say we have chosen, we have decided, we have exercised our agency to create the world we want, right? And that we have recognized the ways in which we have internalized certain values, right? And we can create processes and methodologies that will help us transform those, and something I've been talking a lot about is I think liberation is a compost bin, to be honest, right? Part of the liberatory process is creating compost bins wherever we are. And by that, I mean collectively becoming the container, right, into which we can put in the ideologies that no longer serve us, parts of our own trauma that have held us back, right? And compost bins need light, air, water, dry matter, green matter, right? It needs all of those. And if we think about what we're putting in, what we want to contribute are one of those things or more, right? And we think about what would be the walls of the compost bin so that we can take all those things and transform them into rich soil that will grow the seeds that we're going to plant. And those seeds are seeds of imagination, right? Seeds that remind us our interdependence,
Mm.
right? Seeds that remind us our connection to the natural world, right?
Mhm.
So I've been thinking a lot about compost bin, and I hadn't put it together until this conversation about maybe being able to create and see ourselves as compost bin, um, and compostable
Mhm.
is liberation, is steps towards liberation, being liberated from the ideologies, the internalized oppression, the ways that we've harmed other people also. We talk a lot about how we've been harmed, but we don't talk very much about how we've harmed other people
Yeah.
collectively and individually. Right. So that's how I would envision liberation.